Did you just call me a terrorist, Mr. Speaker? The chamber froze. You could hear the tension in the air like a stretched violin string. Cameras swiveled, phones lit up, aides froze mid-step. Across the room, Zohran Mamdani stood motionless at his desk, fists clenched, voice steady but shaking at the edge, not with fear, but with fury. Mike Johnson, Speaker of the Assembly, didn't blink. He leaned forward with a smile so faint it was nearly a smirk. "If the shoe fits," he said. And just like that, the floor of the New York State Assembly became a battlefield. But how did it get this far? How does a budget debate on housing lead to a verbal assault that ignites the entire political class? And who, in the end, would walk out as the face of courage in the chaos? Let's rewind. It started like any other late-night session in Albany. The chamber was mostly half asleep. Bills were being rushed through, and most lawmakers just wanted to vote, nod, and go home. But not Zohran Mamdani. When the housing provision known as Section 38C appeared, an amendment that would slash rental support in immigrant-heavy districts, Zohran did what Zohran always does. He stood up. He spoke not like a politician, but like someone who'd lived the pain. "This amendment," he began, "is not just a line item. It's a sentence of eviction, displacement, and despair. Let's stop pretending it's about budgets when we know it's about boundaries, racial, cultural, economic." Some rolled their eyes, others whispered. But Mike Johnson didn't whisper. He didn't roll his eyes. He waited. And when Zohran finished, the speaker casually picked up his mic. "We appreciate your performance, Representative Mamdani," he said, eyes locked on Zohran. "But we're legislating, not broadcasting Al Jazeera." That was the first spark, a dig cloaked in condescension, but laced with something darker. The word Al Jazeera wasn't random, it was loaded. It was meant to paint Zohran, a Ugandan-born Muslim socialist from Queens, as foreign, as suspicious, as not fully American. Zohran didn't respond right away. He simply stared. You could feel the restraint pulsing through him like electricity under skin. The kind of restraint that only exists when you've heard words like that your entire life. In airport lines, on campaign trails, in angry emails. He let it go. That night. But the next morning, it escalated. During a closed-door session, witnesses later said Johnson doubled down. "I don't take lectures on American housing policy from someone who sympathizes with Hamas," he allegedly said to an aide, loud enough that 3 others overheard it. The leak hit Twitter within the hour. The fire was lit. And this time, Zohran didn't wait. He stormed into the chamber that afternoon, papers in hand, voice like steel. "Mr. Speaker, I rise today not as a Democrat, not as a socialist, not even as a legislator, but as a man who refuses to be slandered in silence." He read the leaked quote aloud. The chamber gasped. And that's when it happened. Johnson, red-faced but defiant, stood up and said into the microphone what nobody thought he'd dare say out loud. "You walk into this chamber in a keffiyeh, defending Palestine every chance you get, and you're surprised when people connect the dots? If the shoe fits." That's when Zohran said it. "Did you just call me a terrorist, Mr. Speaker?" Boom. Silence. And then, everything changed. If you're still watching this and your heart's racing like ours, take a second to hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next. And drop a comment. Do you think Johnson crossed a line, or was this politics as usual? After that moment, "Did you just call me a terrorist?" The room didn't just fall silent. It froze in history. Journalists in the press gallery stopped typing mid-word. The stenographer hesitated for half a breath, unsure whether to type terrorist as a direct quote or wait for an apology that never came. Mike Johnson gave none. Instead, he looked around the chamber like a man who believed every second of what he'd said. And maybe worse, he looked like he was enjoying the shock. But what Johnson didn't expect was what happened next. Zohran Mamdani didn't scream. He didn't shout. He simply reached for the microphone and said, "You don't get to decide where I belong." And he began to speak, not with fury, but with focus. With the kind of clarity that only rises when you've been pushed too far for too long. You think this chamber belongs to people like you, men who talk down, smile sideways, and never think they'll be challenged. You've worn power like a birthright. I wore mine like armor. Because every time I stand up, someone like you tries to sit me down with slurs wrapped in sarcasm. He paused. My parents weren't born here. I was. But even if I weren't, my voice would still belong here. Because democracy isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn. The applause came slowly. Not from everyone, but from enough to shift the room's balance. A few Democrats stood. Then more. Then even one Republican from upstate, visibly uncomfortable, but unwilling to sit through a moment that would haunt headlines. Mike Johnson tried to gavel order. Representative Mamdani is out of order. I'm not out of order, Zohran cut in, turning toward the speaker's desk. I'm out of patience. The room rippled. A motion was filed immediately after, a formal request to censure the speaker for hate speech unbecoming of the chamber. The GOP called it a stunt. Johnson dismissed it as woke theater. But cameras were rolling now, and the footage had already gone viral. Within 12 hours, the video had over 3 million views on TikTok, reposted with hashtags like #Zohran Speaks and #Not Your Terrorist. Outside the assembly chamber, crowds began to form. Young people with posters, Muslim organizers from Queens, renters' rights advocates, teachers, students, even elderly veterans, one holding a sign that read, "I fought Nazis. That means I fight bigotry here too." Inside, the leadership scrambled. By the next morning, a closed session was scheduled. No press, no live stream, just the assembly members and one question. Should Johnson face disciplinary action for his remarks? Zohran wasn't even supposed to speak that day. But when his name was called for a procedural vote, he stood anyway and said something no one saw coming. I will not vote today, because this vote is not about me. This vote is about all the people who've ever been told, in subtle or blunt ways, that they don't belong in the very country they call home. Silence again. But I want you to look me in the eye when you cast your vote. I want you to decide, publicly, whether you're okay with hate wearing a suit and holding a gavel. It was a masterstroke. Not anger, not outrage, but moral framing that made every legislator confront the moment in their own conscience, not just their party line. Johnson smirked again. I see the performance continues, he said quietly. But this time, no one laughed. A new motion was drafted, not just to censure Johnson, but to strip him of the speaker role entirely, citing persistent violation of ethical norms and inflammatory conduct. Suddenly, what started as a slur had become a political reckoning. And Zohran? He stayed calm. He didn't go on cable news. He didn't tweet a storm. He just kept showing up to the chamber, reading policy, voting bills, meeting constituents, letting the truth build behind him like a tidal wave. You're still here? Then you know something's shifting. If you haven't already, tap subscribe. It helps this story reach more people. And seriously, tell me below, do you think Johnson will survive this? Or is his power finally cracking? The assembly chamber had turned into a courtroom, not in procedure, but in spirit. Every eye was watching. Every word spoken felt like it would be etched into the state's political legacy. By the third day of the scandal, The speaker's seat looked smaller under Mike Johnson. The aura of control he once wore like a tailored suit now clung to him like an old, sweat-stained jacket. No press statements, no apologies, just silence and smugness. But silence doesn't erase what millions had already seen. The Ethics Committee convened a special review, citing extraordinary public concern. 2 Democrats broke party ranks to defend Johnson, claiming Mamdani was weaponizing identity. The right-wing media ate it up. Zohran didn't flinch. He arrived early that morning, alone. No entourage, no signs, no grandstanding, just a slim folder in his hand and calm in his eyes. When his time came to speak, he walked to the center of the chamber. Not his desk, not the mic at the side, but dead center, like he was claiming the heart of the room. And then, he began. Silence has always been the most comfortable kind of violence. It wraps itself in respectability and calls it professionalism. But here's the truth. When you use words like terrorist toward a sitting member of this body, you don't get to demand calm. You want quiet? Try a library. This is democracy. It's meant to be loud. A few scattered claps broke out. Johnson tried to speak, but Zohran raised a hand, and to everyone's shock, the chamber allowed it. This isn't about offense, Zohran continued. I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm demanding your clarity. Either you believe that hate speech has no place in this room, or you believe it does, as long as it's spoken in a suit and tie. He opened his folder. Inside were transcripts, not just from this week, but from previous sessions. Carefully collected quotes. Comments Johnson had made over the past year. Comments about immigrants, urban crime, welfare freeloaders, and what he once called jihadi-adjacent activism. It wasn't a speech. It was a pattern. One by one, Zohran read them aloud. With each line, the room grew more restless. Some turned red. Some avoided eye contact. Some, including moderate Republicans, looked genuinely horrified. It was no longer about a single slur. It was about the culture of permission Johnson had cultivated and concealed. I didn't come here to be tolerated, Zohran said, finally closing the folder. I came here to legislate, but every time I speak, you try to shrink me to a stereotype, and every time you fail, you get angrier. He looked directly at Johnson. You think this seat belongs to you? It doesn't. It belongs to the people of New York. And if they saw what I saw this week, you'd already be gone. At that moment, Johnson stood up, voice raised. This is character assassination. I have a right to speak my mind in this chamber, and I won't be bullied by a freshman socialist with a YouTube fan base. The room went quiet, but Zohran didn't even blink. You do have the right to speak, he said, but when your words are a loaded gun pointed at people like me, don't be surprised when we fire back with the truth. That quote went viral. By evening, #FirebackWithTruth was trending nationally. Students were printing it on shirts. Late-night hosts began mocking Johnson's collapse. Editorials, even from traditionally conservative outlets, called his remarks indefensible. Then came the tipping point. A leaked audio recording, captured during a closed-door caucus lunch, revealed Johnson referring to Zohran as that little terrorist puppet. The recording, raw, scratchy, undeniable, ended with the unmistakable sound of laughter. Everything shattered. 4 Republican members publicly withdrew their support for Johnson. A censure vote was officially scheduled. And Zohran? He said nothing. He let the machine chew its own tail. He spent the day answering calls from constituents, visiting a local school in Queens, and helping an elderly tenant file a housing complaint. No press conference, no mic drops. But everyone knew who owned the moment. If you've made it this far, you're not just watching, you care. So hit that like button, share this with someone who still thinks words don't matter, and drop a comment. What would you have said if you were in Zohran's shoes? It was raining in Albany the day of the vote. Heavy, unrelenting rain, the kind that blurred windows and turned sidewalks into mirrors. Inside the assembly, everything felt hushed, not from lack of noise, but from the weight of what was about to happen. The resolution to remove Mike Johnson as Speaker was on the agenda, and Zohran Mamdani, he didn't look like a man about to take a victory lap. No swagger, no celebration. He looked like a man who understood that justice, even when served, comes late and bitter. The chamber was packed. Press lined the gallery. Protesters gathered outside, chanting in the rain. Inside, every seat was filled, not just by politicians, but by their choices, their values, their silences, their cowardice, or their courage. Johnson sat in his chair like a deflated monarch, pale, angry, but still smirking, as if daring someone to dethrone him. The clerk read the motion aloud, and then the roll call began. One by one, names were called. One by one, votes were cast, some with shaking voices, some with dead eyes, some with the quiet fury of people who had once laughed along and now realized the world had been watching. When Zohran's name was called, he stood, but did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Let the record show, no one is untouchable, not in this chamber, not when you use your power to poison it." Then he sat down. Gasps, not because the words were harsh, but because they were true. The vote took 17 minutes. When the tally was read, it was over. Johnson was removed, 84 to 61. A coalition of Democrats, independents, and even 6 Republicans made it happen. The Speaker's chair sat empty. For a moment, there was only stillness, a pause in history. Then Johnson rose, slowly. He looked at the chamber like it had betrayed him, when really, it had simply seen him. And then he walked out. No applause, no parting speech, just the sound of his shoes on the marble floor and the faint crackle of flashbulbs outside. But the story didn't end with his exit. After the session, a reporter asked Zohran outside, "Do you feel vindicated?" He shook his head. "I feel responsible." "Responsible for what?" the reporter asked. "For the people watching this who have never felt represented, who've been called names behind their backs, who've been told they were too loud, too foreign, too radical. I'm not here to win arguments. I'm here to make space, because if we don't hold power accountable, it becomes permission." The reporter paused, then said, "What do you say to those who think you went too far?" Zohran looked directly into the camera. "I didn't go far enough. Not for every kid who's ever been searched for wearing a backpack. Not for every tenant who gets a 10-day notice while luxury condos get tax breaks. Not for every Muslim who has to prove they're peaceful before they're heard." He walked away, no entourage, soaked in rain. The clip aired that night. It was shared millions of times. And suddenly, Zohran Mamdani wasn't just the assemblyman from Queens anymore. He was the voice people didn't know they'd been waiting for. He became the reason students wrote essays, the reason teachers rewrote civics lessons, the reason someone in Nebraska said, "I don't agree with everything he says, but damn, he's honest." Weeks later, the assembly passed the very housing bill Zohran had defended, this time without the cuts. Quietly, almost shamefully, as if admitting he'd been right all along, but he didn't gloat. He just went back to work. No viral tweet, no media tour, just a borrowed desk, a notebook of constituent issues, and a nameplate that now carried more than just his title. It carried the weight of what happens when you refuse to sit down. If this story moved you, even for a second, take a moment to hit subscribe. Stories like this matter, not just because they're dramatic, but because they're real. And I want to know your thoughts in the comments. What does leadership look like to you? And who would you stand up for when the room goes quiet? Thank you for being here. We're just getting started.